Hi, my name is Lori Richardson, and this is my story. I moved out when I was 17, and I never went back to church again. Like, that was it. I was done. Not even Mother's Day night, even Easter. So I felt like I had to be this strong, well, I was a strong person. So I felt like, okay, I can handle this. I can handle all this stuff on my shoulders. Well, and until life kept happening and happening and happening, and then I wound up making some more bad choices. I ended up being in an abusive, toxic relationship that eventually led to drugs. And for about 18 months, didn't talk to my family. I hadn't seen them for about 3 years. They were starting to do drugs was a step up from where I was. So if that tells you how the darkness that I was in, and with drugs or drinking or whatever, it would have been anything to cope. And so then came shame and guilt. So I was being nudged, and I didn't know at the time I was being nudged. And finally, I had a window of borrowing a cell phone, and got my cousin down there and picked me and my little boy up. 2 weeks of staying with her, I went to church. The second week, I was so filled with the Holy Spirit, I baptized. I gave everything of my darkness to him, is what my way wasn't working. And after 49 years of living in complete darkness, after seeing that light, I want to keep getting it brighter, brighter, brighter. I feel like I'm kind of brave, like David and Goliath. I feel like I could at this point, I can conquer any giants that come my way, because I know I have Jesus in my heart and I can't go wrong. Just, I love the feeling I have when I'm around godly people. I didn't have a car, so I was using the bus routes. And there was some storms, so I reached out to Aaron Ashcraft, like, we've got to help get you a car. And I was like, I know that's on my list, but I was just happy to have a job, and having some money come in of my own. And then, so we reached out to John. I just was fortunate that one Wednesday I was sitting at dinner, and I'm probably gonna cry. And they had a car sitting out there, and they were like, "What do you think?" And I'm like, "Oh, I love it." I was worried about the first thing out of my mouth. I was like, "I don't have enough money yet." And John just pulled me close and said, "Don't worry about that right now." And like, I always felt like people judged me, and would automatically, had formed their own opinions. And not one person here in this church was different at me. Just everybody's inviting, and they just was like how had that hand on my shoulder, and prayed for me. And I just feel loved by everybody here, but most of all by God. And then the last little bit is, if I can give one person know that there is a better way, that there is.
In 2016, I was invited to go backpacking the Appalachian Trail with a group of guys. There's a guy in our community, he's a high school teacher. He had a ministry mindset. He was watching as students were graduating out of high school, these boys graduating out of high school who didn't seem to have purpose, didn't seem to have meaning in their life, no sort of direction. And he had this idea, he had this desire that if he could give them a little bit of a direction, a little bit of an experience, a little bit of an adventure, then maybe it would create some purpose and some meaning. And he wanted to have a spiritual component to it as well. And so he and his buddy kind of put together this idea, and they approached 5 young men that they knew they could trust, that would work with them kind of as a beta test. And they worked out this plan. They built this trip that they were going to go on, and then the friend backed out. And so they needed another adult. And one of the boys who was going was in my student ministry, went to my church, and his mom called and asked if I would go with them and do this, and I said yes, which was the wrong answer. I should have said, what is it? Like, what are we doing? What is this thing? Because I'd never done anything like it. I'd never really camped in the true sense of the word. I'd never backpacked by any sort of means, right? I had some experience in hiking, but it was like simple, small day hike, like simple little things, right? It wasn't real challenging. And so saying yes to this really stretched me, and it forced me to get real serious real quick. And so I started doing some research. And I started looking into some guides and some videos. I started trying to figure out what resources I was going to need, what I would have to be able to backpack and do this well, and what kind of techniques, the things that I just need to learn. I didn't know. And then I started doing the training. I began walking every single day. Excuse me. Started walking every day. Started adding more and more distances, trying my best to prepare myself for that Appalachian Trail, which I don't know if you know this, but it includes mountains, right? And I lived in northern Indiana, which you should know does not have mountains, right? So I did my work as best I could, trying to figure out how I could get in better shape. And as I started doing better, I started carrying a small bag on my back with a little bit of weight, just kind of working up, preparing myself for the day that I would put this pack on when it was full, preparing myself to become more and more comfortable with the greater burden of backpacking. That word burden shows up a few different times in the New Testament. It starts with this one moment with Jesus in Matthew 11. It's kind of a strange one. Jesus has been teaching, and the community he's talking to has predominantly just pushed him away. They've kind of ignored him. They've kind of pushed him off. They're not real interested in the things he's saying. They've kind of rejected him, right? And so he's got some harsh words for them, but then he also, I think, kind of turns a small corner, and he realizes that there's some people who still may be receptive, even if the community has pushed him away. And so he looks into this crowd. He knows that there's individuals who may be interested. And so he says to them, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." I find this teaching from Jesus to be really quite fascinating, really, really interesting, okay? Jesus starts by telling people who are weary and burdened, people who are tired, people who are carrying heavy weight to bring it to him. He's going to take their burden from them. And when we say this, I mean, burden's kind of a generic, vague word. What are we talking about? What kind of things is Jesus asking us to bring to him, right? It can look like a lot of different things. I think for some people, it's going to look like sin. It could be the temptation of sin. Before sin happens, it's the temptation that kind of wears you down. Or maybe it's the other side of sin where it's the guilt and the shame. It feels like a burden on the shoulders that just pulls us down, right? And sometimes that can be a habitual sin, something that we do over and over again. Or maybe it's just a one-time event, that there's one sin, there's one moment in your life that you regret so much, that it was so significant that it just feels heavy, that it hangs on the shoulders, that it weighs us down as we go through life. Jesus says, bring that burden to me. Maybe it's not sin. Maybe it's just pain. Maybe your health is declining. Maybe the relationships that were once strong in your life have now started to crumble. Maybe things have happened in your life that have left you with wounds and scars. Maybe a broken world has kept convincing you and proving to you over and over again just how very broken it is. Some people just carry pain. It feels like a burden. It feels like a weight. It feels like a heaviness. And Jesus says, come, bring that to me. Sometimes that burden could just be struggles. Maybe it's your finances. Maybe it's your dreams at one point, but they're fading. Maybe it's your marriage. Jesus says, come to me, all of you who are weary and burdened, all of you who are tired from sin and pain and brokenness and the struggles of this world. Anyone in here dealing with that kind of stuff today? Have you ever been there? If you've ever felt that way, if you do feel that way, Jesus says he's going to give you rest. He says, bring your burdens to me and I'm going to give you rest. And then he says, take my yoke, which is kind of a weird thing to say, kind of contradictory. A yoke is that big wooden beam that sits on the shoulders of livestock. Do you know what we're talking about? It's something that ties two animals together for the purpose of plowing a field. It's not something that we're going to see a lot today. We get to go back to like black and white photos, okay? But it's that wooden beam. It's a tool for work. It's a heavy tool. And that language that Jesus uses, he didn't come up with this phrase, okay? That was the language of his day. Rabbis would talk about their yoke. It was their rules. Rabbis would shape their teaching. They would shape the things that they focused on, or the things that they thought were important, the things they emphasized. They would wrap all of that kind of stuff up into their teaching, and they would call it their yoke. So Jesus is saying, hey, if you're weary and tired, I'm going to give you rest. Here, take these rules and do this work. Which seems contradictory, right? It seems like it doesn't fit. He says he's going to take our burdens, but then it seems like he gives us burdens. except that he reminds us that he's gentle and humble, that his yoke is easy, that his burden is light. And he says that his yoke will actually bring you rest. What does that mean? That word could be translated as good or suitable or useful. One way of looking at what Jesus means is to think about that word fit. His yoke fits. It's appropriate. It's the right size for you. His yoke fits you. If a yoke doesn't fit an animal, or if a pack like this doesn't fit you comfortably, it will rub your body in the wrong places. It creates raw spots. It actually makes it difficult for the animal to do the work, prevents it, because the pain is too great. The burden becomes too heavy. And what Jesus is saying is that his yoke is carved, that it's crafted to fit you. It was made specifically for you. When he says, my yoke is easy, he's saying that he's got something that's just for you, that you're built for this kind of work. And it's not heavy work, it's not burdensome work, it's work specific to you, work that's perfect for you, work that you've been made for. And it's not too much because you're built for it. And when you think about two livestock being tied together with a yoke, one is always going to be the stronger and the other is always going to lean a little bit more to the stronger one, right? Jesus isn't asking us to lead in this relationship. Jesus is going to take the big burdens. He's taking the big weight. We just have to do our part. We just need to partner with him. The weak one doesn't lead, the weak one follows. Jesus promises to lead, we just have to join in. And so he says, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. As the trip got closer, time got closer, I began working with this pack in a more significant kind of way, right? You can see right now that it's full. It's not full of weight, because I'm not no dummy, all right? Like, I'm not a fool, okay? That's made up of large things that weigh nothing, all right? But whenever this thing is packed for a trip and you're working through it, you're looking at up to 65 pounds in this bag of the things that you need for the purpose of hiking and everything else. And I began working my way up, and there was a specific day where I had this pack fully loaded, probably about 60 to 65 pounds, and I went out to a local state park and I began hiking a mountain bike trail that they had out in that space. And so I'm in the middle of the woods by myself. It's a predominantly flat trail because it is in northern Indiana, and it's a mountain biking trail, so it has all these switchbacks kind of back and forth. And as I'm walking it, I can see very easily back behind where I used to be on the trail, and I see an older gentleman jogging. He's like in his 70s, okay? And he's not fast, but he's faster than me with all this weight on my back, all right? And so I can see that he's running. He's going to catch me eventually, and he does. And when he catches up to me, he stops and begins to walk with me, and he asks me what I'm doing. I tell him that I'm getting ready to hike the Appalachian Trail, and when I do, he immediately just lights up, okay? And when he does, I immediately realize that I know who he is. I've never met him before. I've never talked to him since, but I knew who he was in that moment. There was this preacher in the area who had worked at a different church up in the South Bend area, and he had accomplished the entire Appalachian Trail. He hiked the whole thing from Georgia to Maine. And he wrote a devotional about it. Like, as he was doing it, he wrote his own devotionals. And then afterwards, he actually got this thing published. And so there's this book out there. This is a devotional book that you could buy and read as you're hiking the Appalachian Trail, and read his devotions from the places where he wrote them, which I think is just really, really cool, right? Kind of a neat thing. And so now this guy's walking with me, and he's talking to me about this thing that I'm getting ready to do, right? And he asks where I'm going, and I tell him that we're going to this area in Virginia, and he lights up, and he says, oh, that's one of the most beautiful parts of the whole trail. And we're talking back and forth, and he starts giving me some advice on how to do this well, okay? And his advice is stuff like this: don't carry water with you, which is horrible advice. That's not a good one. You want to cast that one aside, okay? But what I learned was backpackers are obsessed about weight. They want to do everything they can to cut weight. And so this man would hike without water because that's weight to carry. And so he would get to a place where water was. He would fill up his bottles. He would gorge himself on water. That's his word that he used. He would gorge himself, drink as much as he possibly could, force himself to drink even more, and then dump out whatever he had left and start hiking again until he got to water. It's a bad idea. Like, it's a really bad strategy, but it's how he lived, okay? This guy was so obsessive about it. He told me that he cut the end off of his toothbrush. Like that much plastic had him concerned it was going to weigh him down. Like, just obsessive, like crazy things that these people would do to preserve any sort of way, just to slash it in any way possible, right? So he's telling me these stories. I now think I'm in the middle of the wilderness with some madman. It doesn't make sense to me, all right? And then he just casually says, all right, see you later, and takes off running. Never saw him again, all right? Never experienced anything with this guy ever again. He just takes off. Can you believe that in our interaction, he never once offered to carry my bag? He didn't offer to take any of the weight. He was fine with me carrying it. And I was training. I didn't necessarily want him to carry my bag, but like, it was heavy, and I was struggling, and he was running. He was good, right? Just kind of took off on his own. Galatians chapter 6 has a verse that I think is really interesting. Paul writes to the Galatian church, and he says, bear one another's burdens. Bear one another's burdens. Paul's speaking to Christians who were followers of Jesus, this same Jesus who told people to bring their burdens to him. Paul is now telling Jesus followers to take care of each other's burdens, to pick up each other's burdens. And we talked about those burdens earlier, right? He says we should bear each other's burden of sin, that we should help one another with the temptation and the guilt, that it looks like accountability and it looks like encouragement. It looks like coming alongside and supporting someone who's struggling and carrying a heavy load. Paul says we should bear each other's pain. It can be physical, it can be relational. Bearing each other's pain looks kind of like help, support. Bearing each other's burdens looks like help and support. It looks like listening and counseling. It means that we should bear each other's struggles in whatever form they come. It looks like care and compassion. It looks like meeting the physical needs of one another. It looks like helping one another to find solutions. But Paul doesn't just tell us to bear one another's burdens. He tells us something incredibly important, a very important phrase: bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. The law of Christ, the rules of Christ, the yoke of Christ. The reason we bear one another's burdens is because it's a fulfillment of Jesus' law. It's a fulfillment of Jesus' rules. It's the expectations of Jesus. And what is his law? John 13:34. If you've been around a bit, this one should be pretty familiar to you. He says, a new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another. That's the new command that he gives us, to love one another. And that's where we started this sermon series, right? It was in John 13:34. Do you remember that? Doc preached about the love that we should have for one another. And that's kind of the foundational piece. That's the focus of this entire series. All these other topics, anything else that we've talked about in this series called One Another, is really just commentary on how we love each other. When we're talking about bearing each other's burdens, we're talking about one of the practical ways that we prove we love one another, right? It's love in action. And Doc taught us about that word agape, that Greek word for love. It's a different kind of love. It's a God's love. It's a love that's selfless and sacrificial. It's more about the other person than it is about the self. It's unconditional. And when Jesus says to love one another in this kind of way, it's not vague. It's not unclear what he means by it, because it is rooted in him. It's found in the love that we've received from Jesus. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. Jesus forgave us. And he forgives us, and he keeps forgiving us. And so we forgive one another. Jesus constantly welcomed people who didn't feel like they were qualified to be in the presence of anyone who even remotely was important. And so we welcome people who don't qualify to be here. Jesus consistently put others before himself, and so we are called to put other people before ourselves. Jesus took the nature of a servant. That means that we take the nature of a servant. Jesus promises to bear our burdens. And that's why Paul says what he says in Galatians 6, that we should bear one another's burdens. Because when we bear one another's burdens, we are taking his yoke upon ourselves. We're taking his rules upon ourselves. We're taking his law, his way of living upon ourselves, and we're proving that we are his followers. There's another guy in the New Testament named James, who was Jesus' brother. And anytime we mention James, it's always worth pausing for just a moment and asking the question, what would it take for your brother to convince you that he was God? He'd have to raise from the dead, right? Like, that's what it would take. And that's what we have with James. We have this man who did not believe in his brother Jesus until he saw him resurrected and then became a fierce leader in the church. And so James, this now follower of Jesus, is now having one of the greatest testimonies in all the New Testament, and he becomes a leader in the church, and he writes a letter to some churches to encourage them and to support them. And in his letter, James, starting in chapter 2, verse 15, he says, suppose a brother or sister is without clothes or daily food. Brother or sister, that's one another language. That's community language. That's church family language, that we're all part of the same family, that there's a unity that exists among us. He says, suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to him, go, I wish you well, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. What he's saying is that we should care for the needs of one another. And he mentions the physical needs, right? But it's more than that. I don't think we'd limit it to just that. That whatever form of needs present themselves, he says that your faith is dead, that it's not existent if there's not a willingness to carry each other's burdens. One of the most common cop-outs among Christians is that phrase, I'll pray for you. You ever heard someone say that to you and it actually kind of disappointed you? Sometimes we say it and we mean it. Maybe sometimes that's all that we can do, right? I understand that. There's times when you can't meet other people's needs in the way that they need them met, right? And so what you can do is pray, and that's really cool. And I'm not at all demeaning the power of prayer or why we ought to pray for one another. But I think sometimes we use that phrase to get out of doing anything else. Sometimes we say, I'll pray for you just so that we don't have to get involved on a deeper level. James is speaking to a group of people who are saying the right things to one another, but not actually getting involved. If you can do more than just pray, but you don't, James wonders whether or not you're an actual follower of Jesus. If you have the potential to partner with people and to carry their burdens, but you don't, it creates some questions about who you are. So the 7 of us get in the van and we drive out to Virginia. We've got these 5 high school boys who've just graduated, and me and this other adult. We drive through Kentucky, see some really cool stuff, right? We get down into the far southwest corner of Virginia to this little town called Damascus. It's down where North Carolina and Tennessee and Kentucky and Virginia all kind of come together, right? And we get into a little town, we go out to dinner, and then we get back to where we're staying for that night before we hike out the next morning. And when we get together, we sit in a large circle, we each take our packs and we dump them out in front of us, and we start going through them. Because we wanted to cut weight. We didn't want any duplicates of anything, only the essentials. Now, I want you to imagine doing something like this with 5 boys who are 18 years old and what they imagine essentials means. Okay? They had these fantasy ideas in their head of what they thought this was, and they must have just imagined themselves in the woods chopping down trees, because every single one of them bought a hatchet. All right, we had 5 hatchets, and this was in June. We were not going to need to build a fire to stay warm. No one was getting cold, okay? And we had tents. We didn't need shelter. There was really no situation in which a hatchet would have been needed, okay? But we had 5 of them. And so we went through cutting weight, trying to convince the boys, and like even so, they're like, no, I want to carry it. So we had all these hatchets, right? And then I had 3 compasses on me. Because when people found out I was doing this, they just started giving me compasses. I guess that's what you do, I don't know. And so I had 3 compasses. Each of them had like some sort of functional or sentimental value. I can tell you that if our group had been in a situation where it was reliant on me having a compass, we were in so much trouble already. Like, it would not have been good. And so we just had all this extra stuff. And so we began going through it, we began cutting weight, getting rid of the things that we don't need, right? And after we'd gone through all of our stuff, the guy who's leading us, who did have experience in all this stuff, he tells us that we're going to partner up. And so he and I get in a group, and it leaves the 5 boys, so 2 of them get together, and then 3 of them form a group. We partner up. And he tells us that you're going to take the things that you're going to share together, and you're going to distribute it equally among your packs. And the things that you share with your partner would have been primarily your tent and your food. And so this guy who's leading, he looks to me and he says, I'll carry the tent, you carry the food. And I said, okay, that sounds like a good deal, except that the food was way heavier. It was not a good deal, all right? But that's what we did, right? But that's what we did. We went through and we took the things that were unique to us, the stuff that we needed for ourselves, and then we began splitting weight. We began sharing the load. We began sharing the burden that each of us was going to have to carry for this trip. And by the end of the night, our bags are packed, things are distributed equally among ourselves. And the next morning, we take off on this hike, and within 2 hours, we had our first blister. It wasn't me. It was so, like, I was the oldest guy, I was the least in shape, and every time something bad happened, I was so glad it wasn't me. But I can tell you that for the next 4 days, we carried each other's burdens for nearly 40 miles. And all this took on a completely different picture for me several years later. All this for me was in 2016. My boys were pretty small at the time. They watched me train and prepare and take this trip. They wanted to participate. They wanted to be able to do something like this. So in 2021, about 5 years later, we did our own little backpacking trip. Now, the problem they had was they didn't have a good leader. It was just me. And so we did something much safer. I found a 33-mile trail up in southwest Michigan that was straight and was flat and was close enough to home that if something bad happened, I could call. All right, and so it worked really well for the family. We went and did our own thing. It was pretty cool. Now, I knew going into this trip with them, Baylor was 12, Benton would have been 13. I knew that it was going to be a challenge for them. And I knew that they couldn't carry the same amount of weight. I knew the burdens weren't going to be distributed equally, and I knew that it fell on me to make sure that we had everything we needed. There were extra burdens that I carried, and when it was over, I was absolutely exhausted. And I cherish every memory. I can tell you that it absolutely was an incredible pleasure to carry their burdens. And I think that's what unity looks like in any sort of context. You see, for unity to exist, whether that's unity in the church or anything else, it means that we share. We're sharing the good things and the bad things. We share the blessings and we share the blisters. We share the burdens. So when I got married, I received a ton of blessings in my life by marrying my wife. Lots of blessings. I need to emphasize lots of blessings. I also got some debt, all right? And it wasn't a lot. We handled it rather quickly. But there were some burdens that I got with her that we carried together. To be fair, she got way more burdens than I did, right? And I look at our marriage and I can see years of incredible shared blessings. I see burdens that we have helped bear for one another ever since. Our unity means we share burdens. And you've experienced this in your life. You've experienced this whether in the church and in your home, in your family, at work. You've experienced this. You've experienced this if you've ever gone on a diet. That you're going to succeed so much better if you have a partner who goes on a diet with you, right? You're going to be much more likely to succeed if you share in the blessings and carry each other's burdens. That's the power of doing it with someone else, right? And if you start working out with a partner, it improves your likelihood of sticking with it because you have someone who's going to come along and share in the blessings and also help carry your burdens. When it's heavy for you, they'll carry it. When it's heavy for them, you carry it. See, unity in a relationship means we carry burdens for one another. And that's what the church should look like. So bear one another's burdens and fulfill the law of Christ. If you know a widow who misses her husband, it's been years, but she still hurts. She still misses him. Sit with her. Bear one another's burdens. It's Jesus' work. If you have a friend who struggles with addiction, don't just tell them about Celebrate Recovery. Take them to CR. Go with them. Sit with them. Bear one another's burdens. It's Jesus' work. Maybe you're a student, you go to school, you see someone sitting alone at lunch, and they're not your best friend, but you see them, so go join them. Go be with them. Bear one another's burdens. It's Jesus' work. Maybe you have an opportunity to serve at a local soup kitchen. Take that opportunity to bear one another's burdens. It's Jesus' work. If you see someone struggling financially, go buy them groceries. Bear one another's burdens. It's Jesus' work. You see, there's this reality that if it doesn't cost you money, time, or effort, then you're probably not bearing burdens. I mean, when was the last time you had blisters for someone else? 2 final thoughts as we close this out. First one is this. When you want to talk about how to help bear one another's burdens, the first thing you've got to do is start looking for people with burdens, which is kind of obvious, seems kind of straightforward, right? Except that I think the problem is we've trained ourselves not to see people with burdens. We've trained ourselves on how to look at people with burdens but not notice them, to just be able to move past them, almost as if we're going through life with blinders. If you want to get better at bearing one of those burdens, it may start with a simple but very dangerous prayer. Just, God, give me eyes to see and ears to hear. Man, it's a simple prayer, but it's very dangerous. God, give me eyes to see people who are hurting and their burdens and how I can help them. God, give me ears to hear. Help me notice when people are saying things that are little clues into the pain that they're carrying, the burdens and the hurt that they have in their life. God, give me eyes to see and ears to hear those who are hurting or struggling. Second thing to help you with all of this goes back to that idea of a yoke. You've got to see them. You've got to see them in their need, but you've also got to see yourself, how God has prepared you for this. You can't forget that God has built you for this. God has made you, and he's gifted you with talents and abilities to help people. And it doesn't mean that you have every ability to help every person who has every need, but God's fitted you. He's made you so that you can pull where you have work to do. You aren't Jesus. You're not carrying the heavy load, but you are there to help. And so carry the weight you can carry. Support people in the way that you can support them. Bear the burdens that you're capable of bearing, and trust Jesus to handle the rest. Church, we've got to recognize that if we're going to look like Jesus, if we're united, that it means that we're going to bear one another's burdens. I want to lead you in that prayer that I mentioned just a minute ago. Why don't you go ahead and stand with me, and let's pray these words. God, we pray today